I do want to talk a little bit about the Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch Fellowship Program at large. This is our opportunity every year to support early career scientists in a way that supports our mission as the National Audubon Society. The program was launched in 2010, and each year we recruit up to 3 research fellows. These are folks that are, again, early career, typically between the ages of 18 and 30, focused on conservation-related research here on the Research Ranch or more broadly in southeastern Arizona. And these are folks that show a strong conservation ethic and a commitment to doing really good science. Thanks to a generous gift this year from the Research Ranch Foundation, we were able to give a larger award than is typical. Both of our fellows this year received $3,500 to support their research needs, anything from research equipment to food and travel, anything that they need to get their summer season going. And then a $1,000 Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch housing voucher, which allowed these students to stay here on the research ranch throughout the season. And also with this program, these students get some communication support from our Audubon Southwest team, as evidenced by the webinar that you're all participating in right now. Applications typically open in early February and close in late March. So keep an eye out early next year if you or anyone you know might be interested in applying. Matt, if we can go to the next slide. So what you're really here for, you want to know what's been keeping our research fellows busy this year. So just one more click through. So again, we have 2 fellows this year. First, I'll mention Heaven Sanchez. She's a recently graduated master's student from Arizona State University, and she has been helping us explore technology around Motus, which you'll learn more about tomorrow if you join for her presentation. And her focal species have been our kind of suite of specialty grassland sparrows down here on the research ranch, mostly otter-eyed sparrow. And then today we have Matt Jenkins. He is a PhD student with the University of Arizona, and he has been studying Western and azure bluebirds across the Southwest. His research explores how stress influences bird behavior and range, with special attention to our, again, the azure bluebird, our kind of specialty species down here in southeastern Arizona. And his work is really serving to inform conservation efforts for this species. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Matt.
Oh, great. Oh, it's doing the animations. All right, thank you for that introduction, Stephen. So I'm excited to talk to you all about what I've been doing during my PhD and with my funds that were given to me from the Audubon Research Ranch. So my talk is titled Bluebirds, Model Species for Evolution, Development, and Environmental Resilience. And just to start, I am going to be splitting my talk into different parts. And so just to open up, I'm going to be giving you a broad introduction on stress, and then we're going to go into different regional differences that organisms may experience with stress, and then talk about sexually selected traits that can appear in different animals. And so just to jump right in, all organisms experience stress, and much of this stress can often be found, in small bouts throughout the day, or it could even be for longer periods. Much of it's driven, directly by your daily environment. So some examples could include your place of work or who you interact with. And it could also be external, such as environmental, factors like drought, cold snaps, urban development, all of which can lead to a lack of resources. And because of this, many wild animal populations are actually nearing their tipping points, especially in a changing climate. And so species with wide geographic ranges are likely to experience different stressors. And so these stress responses may be similar across regions or locally adapted. And now a great example of this is actually found in house finches, which can be found here in the desert Southwest. They can be found up north in colder mountainous climates. And they also can be found out east in more urbanized areas, especially in cities. However, they did not start out that way. So they have a really interesting story. So originally, they were actually native to the desert Southwest regions of the United States, as well as Mexico, and they were sold under the name Hollywood finches. And so they are a very popular pet because the males have that very bright red plumage. But in 1941, one individual house finch was actually found in New York by a group of birders. And soon after, a whole bunch of other flocks began to start popping up. And this raised a lot of questions about how these birds got there. And so it was discovered that they were being sold illegally in pet stores in the area, as they were now being protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so that's not allowed. And so these birders actually reached out to the National Audubon Society, who sent undercover operatives over to New York, and they actually intercepted these shipments of house finches and fined the businesses that were selling these finches. And so when other pet stores in the area found out that the government was getting involved in finding these businesses, they decided that the easiest thing for them to do was just to release these finches into the surrounding areas. And so they assumed that these birds, since they were desert adapted, would just quickly die in the city, especially in the wintertime because it was too cold. But it turns out they actually thrived. And so what happened next is even more interesting. So plenty of pet birds escape pet stores and colonize new areas. So monk parakeets are a famous example. We also have the lovebirds here in Phoenix, Arizona, that have now colonized that small flock. But what's interesting with house finches is that they can be now found across the country. So within 20 years of their release in New York, they were already found in Boston and Philadelphia. 20 years after that, they were breeding from Maine to Georgia. And today they're one of the most widespread birds across the country. And they're all found throughout the lower 48 states, as well as even Hawaii. And so their adaptability may be the key to their rapid spread. And so they cohabitate really well with humans. They readily feed from feeders, and they nest in man-made nest boxes. But this was still to people's surprise because other birds have done that, like house sparrows and starlings. But even when they're introduced, they still don't take over quite like the house finches have. And so again, you can see that spread in the range map shown on the left. And because this bird, again, was from arid regions, it had to rapidly adapt to this sudden and extreme environmental stress in order to thrive. And now, again, they're a common sight across backyards. But in what ways they adapted to that stress and how that stress has affected their behavioral characteristics as well as their physical characteristics still remains a clear or a big question in the field. And so stress in adults can affect the offspring. And so it's well known that stress by the parents can change and alter how their offspring look and behave. Now, depending on the timing and severity of that stress exposure, these stressors can not only influence how different traits develop, but it can also potentially impact offspring survival and reproductive success. So you can see that there's clear differences between how birds and mammals raise their offspring. So mammals are typically considered more nurturing, and they're able to, get around a lot of the stressors that birds actually put into their offspring, which I'll get into here in just a second. And so stress affects, again, how offsprings develop. And with birds, this can allow us to understand the pathways between stress and how certain traits form. So birds and mammals and other animals all develop differently and are therefore impacted by stress in different ways. So birds deposit hormones into the eggs before laying. And so the embryos are almost released, per se, from developmental stress, while other live-bearing species and other internally developing species are impacted by maternal stress throughout their entire growth period before they're born. And so again, because of this, we can use birds as a great model to look at these pathways with stress and behavioral traits, as well as physical traits. And so it's well known that stress experienced during the developmental period can affect not only how you grow, as we can see here in this nestling on the right picture, but it can also, again, alter how you look and behave. And so in birds, this can lead to different levels of hormones being put into the yolk, which you can see in the pictures on the left. Now, this can lead to hormonal disruption, and then it can lead to differences in their traits later on. And so this is particularly true for sexually selected traits, as they are often impacted by development because they're really hard to produce. And so these exaggerated traits are really common in nature, with many striking examples being found here in these photos. And so, for example, we have the elk with their antlers, we have peacocks with their really large bright tails, and then we have the bird of paradise. This is the male on the bottom left and the female of that same species on the right. So you can see these are all really dramatic examples of exaggerated or elaborated traits. And you're going to hear me talk about this throughout the rest of the talk. And these traits, whether, again, there are bright colors, unique patterns, or very elaborate physical characteristics, can all signal different features of these individuals, such as dominance, mate attraction, or even age. Though how this variation evolves remains a really core question in the field. These traits can vary widely across populations and are often thought to indicate an individual's current condition or health. But how do these traits actually arise? So sexually selected traits can arise from several different mechanisms. The first of which here is mate choice. So this is what people are probably most familiar with, especially with female choice. And so if we see here in this male quail here, they have this very prominent plume or slip knot on top of their head. And so females will actually choose males that have that larger plume. And over time, the plume is going to get larger and larger. And we see that across species as well. And I'll get more into that later. But that plume will indicate something about that male, such as his genetic quality. It could also indicate his parental investment into his offspring. We also see that with cardinals. So female cardinals will choose a male cardinal if he's more red because it indicates he's a better parent. Or it could just indicate his overall age and dominance. So a lot of times females will like to mate with older males because they've proven themselves as good breeders. And so again, those traits are just going to be more pronounced over time. Now, the second mechanism is competition. And now the difference between mate choice and competition is that we typically see competition between members of the same sex. So male-male competition and female-female competition. So some prominent examples are right here. You can see it in the moose with their really large antlers. Lions will also have larger manes if they're a more dominant male. A really well-studied system is actually in elephant seals, as you can see in this bottom left. So that's actually the female next to the male. The males are huge, much bigger than the females, and have a really large trunk. And so males that have a larger proboscis or that larger trunk will actually, it's usually a signal to another male that they're more dominant. And then bison, of course, males will have larger horns and a very large back hump. So that's how competition can lead to how these traits arise. And another mechanism that's common is in sexual conflict. Now, this can lead to what's called an evolutionary arms race between both sexes. And so the way this works is when there's a cost to one sex, but not the other. And so a really common example is here in these guppies. So male guppies will be very bright, as you can see in this picture. So they have really elaborate fins that they use to court these females with, which you can see she's the lower one. But in this species, they're what's called sneaker males that look a little bit more drab than these really elaborate males. And they'll actually get in and try and mate with these females while the male or the pretty male is doing his display. And so because of that, these pretty males are going to evolve more elaborate looking displays, or the females can also evolve better ways to get away from these sneaker males to mate with the better quality quarter males. And so this is just another way that adaptive characteristics can evolve and cause these traits to arise. But this led to one of my questions that I'm interested in answering, which is how the developmental environment can link the behavior of these offspring and their elaborated traits like their plumage later in life. And so one behavior that we know is impacted by developmental stress is competitive ability, which we can measure by looking at individuals' aggression levels. And so this is a well-documented phenomena across animals. And a great example is actually shown here in this photo, which shows a pair of bluebirds fighting off a house sparrow from their nest box. And so house sparrows are highly aggressive, and they often outcompete bluebirds for nesting space, especially around the East Coast. But occasionally, bluebirds are able to win these battles and keep their nest boxes from the house sparrows. But the question here is, what makes one bluebird a better competitor than another? And can we tell their competitive ability just by looking at their feather coloration? So we know two things here in this case. We have this well-documented effect of stress on behavior, but we also know that the developmental environment can affect the display of ornamental traits in other species. So it's possible that this same mechanism of stress is the link between elaborated traits and an individual's competitive behavior. And if this is the case, I hypothesize that both competitive ability and trait elaboration should be higher in low stress compared to high stress environments. And if that's true, it should produce a link between traits and competitive ability that we often see in sexually selected traits, which is what I get in with my second prediction here. So we expected that the better a competitor is, the more elaborated their trait would actually be. All right, so that concludes my introduction, just introducing you to stress, regional differences, and how sexual traits can actually evolve. And now I'm going to tell you about my study system. So we can talk about some bluebirds now. So bluebirds provide a really great way to test these questions as they boast really striking blue plumage across all three species. They vary widely geographically as well as in their habitat requirements. And they're really easy to work with because they're cavity nesters. So we can set up our man-made nest boxes, and that allows us to monitor them really closely. I will mention and show all three species throughout this talk, but for the purpose of today's presentation, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the western bluebird right here in the middle, using our long-term monitored population of western bluebirds in Montana. And so bluebirds provide a really great system to look at how elaborated traits function as they boast really striking blue plumage. And bluebirds also have this really bright rusty red breast patch in both sexes, though males do have that more elaborate plumage, as you can see in that picture on the left with the male on the right. And so previous work has showed that in this system, there is a maternal effect in competitive ability where stressed mothers produce aggressive dispersive sons. Now, this gives us a really unique opportunity to examine whether stress is in fact linking all of these different behaviors as well as their physical traits. However, what we don't know is how that developmental environment may be impacting their plumage and whether their plumage is actually reflective of their competitive ability. So we still had to figure that out. And so now I want to show you how the maternal effect actually works. So we know that the aggression we measure is related to the ability to get different territories. And once they get them, it can have knock-on effects from the maternal stress. And so the way this works is it starts when there's increased competition for resources such as nesting space. And so you can see up top at this graphic, bluebirds are going to be fighting over nest boxes early on in the breeding season. And so the females then become stressed competing for these resources, and this can trigger that maternal effect. And then we get to the second step right here, where these mothers then deposit these hormones into the eggs. And once those hormones are in there, this can lead to what we call a sex-biased hatching order, where sons are actually laid first in the clutch and daughters last. So the sons are almost given preferential, laying order in this case. And once they hatch, these sons have been found to be more wired and be more aggressive. And then they go off into new areas to colonize and take over a better habitat than where their stressed out mother was. And so, again, these birds nest in cavities in trees, and distribution of these cavities can be pretty variable. So some can get territories with multiple cavities and some with only a few. And so in this system of bluebirds, we are reliably able to tell the stress of these individuals based on this stress proxy, and then we can therefore predict the behavior of the juveniles going forward in the future. And so now I want to tell you a little bit about bluebirds' plumage, so what I'm actually measuring. So bluebirds actually have two different types of colored plumage. They have structural plumage, which is their blue feathers, but they also have pigment-based plumage, which is their rusty red breast patch. And so let's talk about structural color really quick. So there are two different types, and the first of which is called iridescent color. And so the best known examples of iridescent structural colors are in hummingbirds. And so the way iridescence works is by light refracting off of tiny little structures in the feathers. And so it almost works like a glass prism when you hold it up to the light and look at the rainbows. And so the light is split into color depending on the angle that you view it. And you've probably noticed this even when you're just watching your own hummingbirds at your own backyard feeders, that sometimes they look really colorful and then they can just turn slightly and then all of that color vanishes. And so other examples of iridescent feathers can be seen in that purplish green feathers in crows and ravens. Now, the other type of structural color is non-iridescence. And so the way this one works is when tiny air pockets in the feathers just scatter the incoming light, that results in a specific non-iridescent color. And probably the most common one in this case is blue. And so while other color wavelengths are absorbed by that black melanin layer that you can see below, the blue color is what's reflected back to our eyes. And so blue colors and feathers are almost always produced by non-iridescent structural color. And so some other common examples you can think of are indigo buntings, blue grosbeaks, and then a multitude of different jays. So that's their structural coloration. And now they also have, like I said, their pigment-based plumage. And so this is actually really interesting because when we're measuring their plumage, they could actually have two completely different developmental pathways. And so this pigment is actually based on melanin. And so while their blue coloration has been linked in other studies to, mate quality, it's also linked to their age. The melanin breast patch in bluebirds is a little bit less studied. However, other studies have found that melanin is usually linked to dominance in a variety of taxa. So that's what we expected to see in this case as well. All right, and so to look at these effects, we used our long-term monitor population of Western bluebirds in Montana. And so just looking at these pictures here, the males are more elaborated, but the females do still exhibit those colorful traits. So you can see the male is a much darker, richer blue, but the female is that lighter blue. And so when we're in the field collecting data, this is one of the pictures that we take. So we take a picture of their breast patch, their back, as well as taking a couple feathers from them. And so the data set that I'm going to be showing you, or the data that I analyzed, comes from a long-term data set spanning about 10 years that was collected from a former undergraduate in the lab. All right. And so what I wanted to look at is I hypothesized that if the developmental stress is the link for both the elaboration of plumage traits and aggression, that we should see for prediction one, that plumage elaboration is greater in low stress environments rather than high stress environments. Now, this makes sense when you think about it, because if there is some kind of constraint from stress, then we should expect that individual to be a little duller. Now, alternatively, for prediction two, traditional sexual selection theory again tells us that the more aggressive individuals will typically be the ones displaying these more elaborated traits. So again, you can think back to the elk with the large antlers, or the lions with a really large mane, or the elephant seals with their large nose. However, in this case, if there is a developmental constraint on this coloration, then we could see the actual opposite trend, where more aggressive individuals are actually less elaborated. All right, so now I want to tell you how we actually measure and collect our data. So the first thing we get is aggression levels. And so to do that, we use what are called competitor trials. And so this is where we place a cavity nesting competitor on top of a mated pair's nest box, and we film their behavior for 2 minutes. So up in Montana, the most common nest box competitor for bluebirds is tree swallows. And so they're a fierce competitor for these bluebirds up north. And hopefully this video keeps playing. But previous work has shown that by running these between species trials, we can get a really accurate measurement of this pair's aggression. So you can see that the female, who's the one sitting on top of that post, she's a little bit less aggressive, and this is what we find on average with Western bluebirds. So males are usually going to be the first ones to respond. You can see that male is really diving by, where the female is mostly just observing until later on in the video. And so we can actually score each of these behaviors and again, get a really accurate measure of their aggression. Now, here in Arizona, it's interesting because we don't actually have tree swallows that nest here with the Western bluebirds in this case. So I've had to play around with what competitor we can use. So we've used mounts of taxidermy bluebirds. The best case example would be to use violet green swallows, but they don't really nest at the same time as the bluebirds in this area, and they don't really utilize our nest boxes. We only had a couple violet green swallows use our boxes this summer. But one competitor that's really common and found throughout the region, both at my sites in southern Arizona and northern Arizona, are ash-throated flycatchers. And so I was able to capture some flycatchers and use them in these aggression trials, and it elicited a very similar response to what you see here with these Western bluebirds in Montana and tree swallows. All right, so that's how we get our aggression scores. And now we actually have to go in and measure the variation in that blue plumage. And so what we do is I take a tail feather from each adult individual that I capture, And we put those onto a handheld black chalkboard, like you can see here in this little image. Now, what this does is it prevents background reflectance on these feathers. And then I go in and use a device called a spectrometer, which you can see here in this lower image. So essentially, it's just a little box that has a couple different hoses that are hooked up to it, or probes. And we have a very bright light source that's connected to those probes. And you can scan over the feathers, and the resulting image will look like what it shows here on that laptop. So we can get an instant measure of that variation in the feathers. Now, for our feathers, we take measurements at 2 different spots, so 2 centimeters from the base of the feather, and then we find the area of peak reflectance, so where is the most blue on that feather. And this is what the result from a spectrometer reading looks like. So you can see that there's 2 different lines. There's the black line on top and the blue line on the bottom. And again, that comes from the 2 different spots that we actually measure these feathers at. And so the area of peak reflectance is the top line, and then the area that's 2 centimeters above the base is the lower line. And you can see that clearly the peak of all these feathers color is mostly in the blue spectrum, but it also goes into the UV spectrum. So birds can see and perceive UV light. And in bluebirds, there's actually been a lot of studies done on their UV coloration as well. So it's pretty interesting to see this up close. All right. So now to talk about our stress proxy. So again, in these stressful environments, the males are laid or hatch first. And so this is that sex-biased hatching order that I was telling you about earlier. And we use this as a proxy for measuring the developmental environment. So Western bluebirds will, on average, lay a clutch size of about 5 to 6 eggs, and they hatch over a period of 24 to 40 hours. And they hatch asynchronously. So again, that first laid is usually going to be the first one to hatch. And so this asynchrony in their hatching leads to size differences as they age that we can then use to assess that sex-biased hatching order. And so you can look at this picture on the left. The first nestling in the hand, the one closest to the fingertips, is the largest nestling. So that's the one that hatched first. And you can see that they get progressively smaller as you go down the line. And again, we know from previous work that in stressful conditions, mothers will produce sons first in the clutch and then daughters later. And these sons are predisposed to be more aggressive and disperse upon leaving the nest. And so looking at this figure, this comes from previous work conducted by a previous grad student in my lab, as well as my PI. On the x-axis, you can see maternal stress increasing. And on the y-axis, we have the number of males produced early. So the greater the stress in the mothers, the more sons are being produced. So this gives us a really nice repeatable system to actually look at this developmental environment and how it impacts the stress of the offspring. Okay, and so now getting back into my predictions, we wanted to answer, does the developmental environment affect blue coloration? And so I expected that individuals in high stress environments would be less elaborated, and individuals in low stress environments would be more elaborated, because again, that's what traditional sexual selection theory would tell us. But what we found is actually the complete opposite. And so sons born in more stressful conditions had bluer plumage as adults. And so this relationship is again shown here in this figure on the right. So on the x-axis, we have the stress environment from high stress to low stress, and then plumage elaboration on the y-axis. So you can see that the bluer males are the ones that are being laid first in the clutch. And so it's possible that our results reflect an influence of that sex-biased hatching order rather than the maternal effect. And this is because the more ornamented sons are likely coming from those earlier positions in the clutch, and the less ornamented or the less blue individuals are from the later positions. And so this is interesting because laying sons first in a stressful environment may actually be a strategy in this case. So these firstborn nestlings have a size advantage over their siblings. And it may be that when you have a really stressful environment, that females are putting those sons into the advantaged positions, giving them that size advantage when competing against their siblings. But overall, this is kind of a confusing pattern because, again, it's counter to what we predicted. And so we expected sons in the stressful nests to have that duller plumage, but it was the opposite effect. However, we still could see a link to competition. Because those sons are wired to be aggressive and dispersive, this might actually be really beneficial for them going into a new area. Because when they're colonizing a new habitat, they have to compete for territories, they have to find mates, and mate choice and age have all been linked to that blue plumage, which females like to select for. So it's possible that it's beneficial to be bluer for these earlier laid males. And now I wanted to go in and look at the melanin breast patch. And again, these have been more often shown in competitive dominance versus like mate quality in the blue coloration. And so the way we did this is we actually traced the outline of these breast patches on the bluebirds. And so we then went into a computer program, and this can tell us a really exact size of this breast patch. And going back to my predictions, we then again expected that the more aggressive individuals would have that larger breast patch because melanin is linked to aggression and dominance in other species. We expected to see the same thing in these bluebirds. However, just like with blue coloration, we actually found the opposite effect. So less aggressive birds had larger breast patches, more aggressive birds had smaller breast patches. So you can see on the x-axis here of this figure, as patch size increases, the aggression score actually decreases, or sorry, as the aggression score increases, the patch size decreases. And so this figure is shown right here, and this goes for both males and females. So both sexes didn't differ in their breast patch size, although female aggression is on average lower than male aggression. So females are the black circles here and males are the white circles. And so we also found that patch area was not correlated with our maternal effect proxy. And so to summarize these results, patch size is related to aggression, but not the maternal effect, is what we want to take away from this. And so after we measured the size, what we found is that, after we measured the size, we then wanted to go in and look at the color because we expected that, maybe that even though the breast patch is smaller in birds, it could be redder. So we wanted to look at the intensity of that breast patch coloration. But what we found is that breast patch color is higher for birds with larger patches, but only in older birds. And so this is the opposite, again, of what we predict if breast coloration is driving that link to aggression. And so we can conclude that even though breast patches are correlated with aggression, it might be signaling something else, something like parental care, because the more elaborated birds are less aggressive, and there is a known trade-off between being aggressive and also being a good parent. So this is definitely something that we want to explore going forward in the future. And so just to summarize my findings, there's going to be a lot of tables shown here. So the table on the bottom is going to take you back to my predictions to show you how my predictions relate to what we actually found. And so just to summarize everything, we know that there are now multiple different developmental pathways for how plumage traits develop and evolve. And this also differs for both that structural blue color and the melanin breast patch. So they don't overlap. So this could indicate fundamentally different aspects of development for this species. And so what we found for blue coloration is that there is an effect from the developmental stress environment. So again, those earlier late sons were the more blue individuals. However, we didn't find any effect of blue coloration with competitive ability. Now, that's not to say that there isn't one. And there's actually some things we want to explore further with where their blue is actually positioned on the feathers that could link to competitive ability. So that's something we want to explore. Now, for red coloration, we didn't find any link to the red breast patch and developmental stress, but we did find a link to red coloration and competitive ability. And so remember, the smaller patched birds were the more aggressive individuals, and the larger patch birds were the more colorful. So it was a little bit opposite of what we predicted in this case, but there is a link to competitive ability and the red breast patch. And so that similar pattern that we found in both sexes for the breast patch could be really interesting because it could indicate that there's some form of mate choice going on. So birds with certain size breast patches may be selecting a mate that also has a similar size breast patch. So again, something for us to look at. And then I also want to see or explore the relationship between that blue color and that sex-biased hatching order, and whether that is a potential survival strategy in sons, the ones that go off to disperse, like I was telling you before. And by doing this, this will also allow us to explore the mechanism behind the sex-specific hatch order, because if you were wondering, we actually have no idea how the mothers are preferentially putting sons first in the clutch. So it's likely that it's hormonally based, but we're still not sure of the exact mechanism that's actually controlling what sex is being laid when. All right, so that is the bulk of my talk. We went over stress, regional differences, sexual traits, then the study system, and I showed you my results. And now I want to show you the next steps and what I plan to do in the future with my funds, as well as with the data that I collected over the summer. And so the first thing I want to look at is with plumage and development, is looking at the colonization dynamics between sister species. And so this past winter, I set up a brand new field site at Hart Prairie Preserve with the volunteers of Northern Arizona Audubon Society, which was really exciting. And what's really cool about this site is both Western bluebirds and mountain bluebirds are found here. And so by putting up these nest boxes, we'll be able to observe colonization dynamics between these two species. And so with a warming climate, we've actually started to observe that Western bluebirds are moving up in elevation to where they encounter mountain bluebirds more frequently. And previous work that has been conducted in my lab has shown that the more aggressive Western bluebirds will displace the mountain bluebirds over time. And so we found this in Montana. Now, it'll be really interesting to see if that same pattern is what we observe here in Arizona. And so what's different is these two species in Arizona are year-round residents. So they're kind of interacting with each other all year round, versus in Montana, they migrate to get away from the really cold winter. And so we could see very different patterns of behavior with these two species, or something, very similar. And so just preliminary data that I collected this summer, there are 14 active mountain bluebird nests at Hart Prairie, but there were only 2 Western bluebird nests that I found. And so just very beginning looking at these colonization dynamics, it seems to be the same pattern, but we can't tell that just from one field season. So next year will be really interesting to see if we start to see more Westerns start to pop up at this field site and start to push out the mountain bluebirds just a little bit. Now, what's also really cool with the Western bluebirds here in Arizona is that there are different subspecies from the Western bluebirds that we have up in Montana. And so the subspecies in Arizona is called the Sialia mexicana bairdi, and the ones in Montana are Sialia mexicana occidentalis. And just looking at these two pictures, you can clearly see the difference in their plumage characteristics. So the Arizona Westerns have that really bright, rusty red back patch, but they also have that breast patch. So this is a brand new trait that we can observe just here in Arizona with these birds, versus the ones in Montana. They do sometimes have that red breast patch, but it's nowhere near as pronounced as the subspecies that's found here in the Southwest. So it'll be really cool to see if that back patch is also signaling something in addition to the breast patch. And so I then want to look at regional differences across environmental gradients with these birds. So in addition to our Montana populations, I also collect data in northern and southern Arizona, as you can see indicated by these red dots. And I also had a really exciting opportunity to collaborate with Dr. Jean Fair at Los Alamos in New Mexico to study her long-term monitored population of Western bluebirds. And so these bluebirds at Los Alamos have been found to have several different behavioral characteristics than the established populations we work with, such as a lower recruitment rate of offspring. And so in Los Alamos, they have about a 4% return rate of offspring. And so bluebirds have what's called high site fidelity. So a lot of the offspring will actually return to the areas where they hatched. But at Los Alamos, only about 4% of them return. Now, this could indicate that these populations are in a much more stressed habitat that is producing these dispersive males. And so this makes a really interesting contrast with both our Montana and Arizona populations, where both of them have been found to have around a 20% return rate of offspring. And so it's interesting why there is such a huge divide between these regional sites. So again, I want to look at their behavioral differences across all these gradients, as well as their plumage characteristics. And just looking beyond geographical comparisons, my study will allow us to view these effects across all 3 species of bluebirds in Arizona. And so Arizona is actually really unique in that it's one of the only states where all 3 species can be found breeding in the same area. And this allows us a great opportunity to look at these sister species interactions. Are they using their plumage to signal to one another? We could also see possible hybridization events that can occur as a result of this range dispersal, because all 3 species can hybridize and produce fertile offspring with each other. And so now I'd like to tell you about my work actually at the Appleton-Whittell Audubon Research Ranch, which is pictured here. So I have been very fortunate to spend the last 3 field seasons of my PhD on the ranch collecting data. And I always manage to find something really cool or learn something new about the species I'm working with out here. But the work that I'm doing here is actually not on Western bluebirds, but instead on a very special species called the azure bluebird. And now the azure bluebird is a unique and distinct subspecies of the eastern bluebird that's only found here in extreme southern Arizona in northern Mexico. And so you can see their range circled in that red circle. So the purple below that circle is actually getting into the Mexican subspecies. So the azure bluebird is really only found around that red circled area. And they are geographically separated from the East Coast lineage of eastern bluebirds. So looking at this range map on the right, all of that purple, blue, and orange coloration are the East Coast lineage of bluebirds. And so because they have become separated over time, there are very clear noticeable differences between the two lineages. And so some of these include differences in their plumage. So azure bluebirds are typically a little bit duller. And you can even see in this picture I took of this female azure bluebird, her blue is almost completely reduced. There's almost no color on her back. And even that red breast patch is very diluted. It's a very light orange. They're also a little bit smaller than the East Coast Easterns, and they have a higher pitch, shortened song. Now, what's even cooler, I think, about them is they display higher rates of cooperative breeding behavior, which, is not super uncommon in bluebirds. We do see it about every season, but usually it's when returning males will come back and help rear that new nest of offspring with their parents. But what I found with the azure bluebirds is that we've actually had two female helpers come back and raise these nests of chicks. And that is extremely rare. It's only been documented a handful of times in that East Coast lineage of bluebirds. But just looking at the azures, it seems to be more common with them. And so we want to answer why that is. So with them, I'm interested in the same questions with them as the Western bluebirds, because again, they have these stark differences in their plumage, and they are the most arid dwelling bluebird, which makes them really interesting to research because they have to deal with these extreme environmental stressors, which could explain their differences in behavior. However, I have found them a little bit difficult to work with because they are actually listed as vulnerable by the state of Arizona. And that's just one step before being listed as endangered. And they were actually listed as vulnerable about 20 years ago. So they should have another population test for them to see how their numbers are doing. But they're also pretty hard to find. They're really picky in where they like to nest. So they pretty much only nest between 4.5 to 6,000 feet in elevation and within live oak savannas. And this has really been to their detriment, as my work has shown them to be pretty prone to environmental stressors affecting their nesting habits. So I've monitored their nesting activity on the Appleton-Whittell ranch for the last 3 summers. So summer 1, we had 0 nests. Summer 2, we had 3 nests because I moved some nest boxes around to better habitat. And then this summer, we had 0 nests on the ranch. And across all my active sites for the azure bluebirds, we only had 3 active nests for this summer. And so their populations have steadily been declining in the states since the 1970s. They used to be found in the Catalina foothills and have now pretty much declined all the way to the Santa Rita Mountains, which are the most extreme northern portion of their range. And so nest box programs that have been implemented in the east have greatly benefited bluebirds, as much of the tree cavities that they use for nesting have been lost. However, these nest box programs are not common here in Arizona at all. And one question I'm trying to actually answer is how these birds respond to these new nesting resources. And so preliminarily, just looking at their data, their nesting numbers seem to be correlated with the drought levels here in the winter. And so southern Arizona typically receives around 2.5 inches of rainfall in the winter. And these winter rains are crucial not only for the vegetation in these ecosystems, but also for the emerging insects that early spring nesting birds, such as the bluebirds, rely on. So again, in 2023, we had a total of 10 nests, but I only had 1 active site at this time. In 2024, this was the first field season where I was able to set up, multiple new nest box trails across southern Arizona, as well as when I moved boxes on the Appleton-Whittell ranch to more live oak savanna areas. And that year, we had 4.63 inches of rain in the winter, and we had 17 active nests across all the sites, which was great. And then this was actually the first record of the azure bluebirds nesting on the Appleton-Whittell ranch, which is fantastic. So this is one of the last strongholds for this bird in the United States. So it's really exciting that I've gotten them to nest on the ranch's property. And so more data will be needed to see if the drought experienced during winter is what's impacting the nesting efforts by these birds. Because again, in this winter of 2025, we only had a quarter inch of rain and there were only 3 active nests. And this was only at one site. So I have about 60 boxes set up here in southern Arizona, and we only had 3 nests. So they were not doing well for this breeding season. And so again, I have to still find out if this winter rain is correlated to their nesting success, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that other arid dwelling species like roadrunners can actually delay their egg laying by 3 weeks and overall reduce the number of offspring that they produce. And so being able to understand what factors are influencing their reproductive success of these birds is super crucial to predicting how their populations are going to react to a changing climate. And so with that, I would just like to thank my PI, Renee Duckworth, for all of her help over the years with my project, as well as my lab mates, Haley G. and Juliana Costers. Additionally, I'd like to thank Carmen Sanchez Moreno, Robert Kirkham, Alex Badyev, as well as members of the Northern Arizona Audubon Society, all for helpful feedback with my presentations, as well as all of my funding sources that have allowed me to do this work across the country. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. Both for the presentation and for the work. You know, a big part of my job here at the Research Ranch is to learn about and work to protect our valuable kind of species of conservation concern that call the ranch home. And thanks to you, this is one of those birds that I don't have to worry about because you're out there doing the work for me. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into the Q&A here. Excuse me, I'll just go ahead and start at the top. Julie Collins asks, do you take the sample tail feathers from the same position from bird to bird, or is it expected that all tail feathers will exhibit the same amount of?
Sorry, you cut out there at the very end, but I think I got the question. Yes, we do take the same tail feather from each individual. So if you're familiar with the number system for tail feathers, we take the second inner right tail feather, which is number R5. And this is just to standardize those measurements across feathers because different feathers can have different variation in their coloration. Yeah.
Cool. Then Liz B asks, do bluebird sons help raise later clutches?
Yeah. So those are the helper males that I was talking about later on in the talk with the azure bluebirds. So yes, and we can see that within a nesting season. So sometimes bluebirds will have multiple broods, and sometimes the males from the first brood will help raise those second brood nestlings. Now, it's not super common. We do see it about every year in bluebirds. But yeah, we see it more often in western bluebirds than the other 2 species.
Interesting. Stephen Vaughn, is it possible that the less aggressive males were older and more experienced and may need to be less aggressive? The lower stress could allow the development of larger, brighter breast patches.
That's an interesting point. So with bluebirds, I don't think I touched on this too much, but their plumage does change throughout their life. That's one of the things I'm looking at. So we age them in 3 different stages. So they have the nestling stage, then they have their second year stage, and after second year stage. And so when they're in their second year plumage, those are actually the feathers that they grew in the nest. And so once they go through a full molt season the next year, we call them after second year individuals, and they're all going to be more bright. And so are more elaborate, I guess you could say. So they will have a little bit of a bigger patch. They will be a little bit more blue as they age. Now, what we find in bluebirds is that their behavior is pretty much standard throughout their whole life. And their plumage doesn't change that much, but that's an interesting point, and that's one thing that I'm going to be looking at this semester is if age does play, a really strong factor in their aggression levels. But we do find it to be pretty standard throughout their life if we're able to measure them that long.
This next one is more of a congratulations than anything from Lori Wayne Chestnut out of Wyoming. Her Audubon chapter there is doing work with bluebirds and was very interested in this talk as a result. So if you're ever looking for a Wyoming contact, let me know.
That'd be fantastic.
Why aren't there any mountain bluebirds in Wyoming from Virginia Jenkins?
From Virginia. You know, there are mountain bluebirds in Wyoming, but they're going to be up at higher elevations. So mountain bluebirds like to nest around more aspen grove type habitat. They're not going to be found as low as you may find western bluebirds. Now they actually have expanded their range a little bit too. So back in the day, western bluebirds are probably doing the worst of the three species because just out west, bluebird trails or bluebird box trails are not as common. A lot of efforts in Montana and Wyoming have actually are the reason why there's western bluebirds still in those states. So they're gradually spreading, mountain bluebirds more so too. It just depends where you are. So mountains would be more in the western part of Wyoming.
Sure. I've got one from Tice Plea. House finch studies have linked deeper red in males to diet.
Mhm.
Um, is that the case in bluebirds as well?
No. So the red coloration in house finches is actually from carotenoids. And so carotenoids are based on what they eat. And so here in Tucson, where I live, there's a lot of yucca plants with red flowers. And the house finches, we find eating those a lot will have a lot brighter red feathers. But the breast patch on bluebirds is melanin. And so that's kind of a fixed pigment. So it's not influenced by their diet.
Right. Um, the observation that mothers lay male eggs first, is this common for other bird species as well, or is that a bluebird thing?
Yes, yes. So this maternal effect is common, oh my gosh, in almost all taxa. So we find it in mammals, reptiles, fish, birds. In mammals, it's interesting. It's almost the opposite pattern. So stressed moms will actually make daughters a lot of the time versus sons. So in birds, yeah, it's males over the daughters. But yeah, it's found in many, many, many other species.
Right on. We've got a lot of questions here. I'm just going to keep peppering you with them, Matt. Did you have any personal growth or development through the experiences on the ranch? Did it influence any of your personal aspirations or future career pursuits? And that's from Audubon Southwest's very own Katie Weeks.
Hmm. Personal growth while out at the ranch.
Or just during the field season through
I,
this project.
you know, I learn a lot about myself every field season because I'm out there by myself. I don't have any field techs, so it's many, 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 many hours of me sitting in the woods by myself staring at birds. So it's a lot of deep thinking. Um, in terms of, I guess, career aspirations, I've wanted to do this since I was a kid. About 8 years old, I wrote a letter to myself saying my dream was to go, to grad school and become a professor. So that really hasn't wavered too much since I grew up. So it hasn't really affected my career aspirations. In terms of learning about myself, I guess I learned how strong I can be when it's 115 degrees outside and I'm monitoring these trails. A lot of great people like Steve, at the ranch. I've learned a lot about the Azure bluebirds, so I'm the first person to study them in depth. So we learn a lot of cool things about the species that are out there as well.
Yeah, there's nothing like a summer in the field to bring you closer to yourself for
Right,
good or bad.
right.
Um, do unstressed females lay eggs of male and female equally without laying males first?
Yes, yeah. So we can directly tell that if that mom is stressed, if those males are laid first or the females later. So it's interesting. And one thing I want to look at between all of my Northern Arizona sites, because I have several, not just that one that I was telling you all about. And I did find differences just quickly looking at my data that some sites had, almost all females, some sites had almost all males, and some were a good mix. But yeah, the non-stressed mothers are going to produce offspring kind of just at random.
Cool. And kind of related, so I'll skip ahead to this one. How do you determine the sex of an egg?
So we can't tell the sex of the egg, but we have to go in and look at the offspring. So during the field season, we're pretty much at those nest boxes almost every day if they're being active. And so we mark each egg when it was laid, as you saw, I think previously on the pictures of the eggs with the embryos. So we mark with a tiny little Sharpie what position they were laid in. And then when they're around 10 days old, we can actually sex them. You can tell the
Cool.
sex if you go in and get, the yolk from the egg, but we don't do, or I don't do that for my work. Yeah.
Cool. Um, let's see. Are the returning helpers assisting because of stress, drought, or other factors?
Hmm. That's a good point. That really hasn't been explored much in bluebirds. We do see that you did mention drought. Yeah. So we do see less helpers when there is a high period of drought. And so this year I didn't observe any helpers actually with Western bluebirds. In the azure bluebirds, I found one female helper, which again, that is extremely rare.
Oh, interesting.
So it is influenced by drought for sure. Now, there hasn't actually been, as far as I know, in Bluebird's work that showed if the helpers are actually doing anything to increase the survivability of the offspring. So when I watch the helpers, sometimes they'll have food in their beak and they'll peek in the nest to the nestlings, but then they'll just leave and eat that food by themselves. So there's a lot of debate as to whether they're actually helping out the nest or if they're kind of just hanging around and checking on their little siblings.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. I think this will be the last one for you, and I like it because I know the ant. Oh wait, nope, they're still coming in. I lied.
Nice.
Have you coordinated with Tucson Bird Alliance, formerly Tucson Audubon, in your
Yeah.
bluebird studies?
Yes. So our main field site for the Azure Bluebirds has been maintained by Tucson Bird Alliance for the last decade um, at one of our sites down in Sonoyta, Arizona. So we have a couple volunteers that help monitor those boxes with me from Tucson Bird Alliance for sure. Yeah. And I update them on everything that we find with the Azures as well.
Right on.
Great help.
Any stress differences in birds
Oh,
in tree cavities?
you're cutting
Oh,
out.
I'm sorry, I'm over my microphone, aren't I? Have there been any studies of the stress differences in birds that nest in tree cavities versus man-made nest boxes?
Yeah, that's one thing that my advisor actually wants to figure out. Off the top of my head, I can't think of studies, but there's definite differences between the two. So trees have much better insulation, especially during, harsh winter events like cold snaps versus nest boxes that don't. But nest boxes have better protection from predators versus trees. So in natural studies, about 80% of natural tree cavities will be predated. Again, that can change depending on what region you're in, and that number will dramatically decrease if you actually use a man-made nest box. And when we do put up nest boxes, the birds do seem to almost prefer them over a natural tree cavity. I don't know if it's because they're more exposed, they see them better, but that's definitely something that we want to look at going forward too.
Do you know if this work will contribute or could contribute to the separation of the azure bluebird as a separate species?
Well, that's one of my secret research projects, actually. Yeah, so I personally think they are very distinct, enough to be considered possibly the fourth bluebird. When you look at them, they're very clearly an Eastern, but they've been separated for so long now. They look different, they sound different, they behave different. They're so interesting. I think they're the most interesting of the species. But yeah, so we are putting in work to get some whole genome sequencing done on the samples that I collect from them. Because this is interesting. So bluebirds were actually split into subspecies in like the mid 1800s, and the way that was done is by their plumage coloration, not actually by genetics, which because they didn't have that power back then. And so that still hasn't been explored even to this day. So that's definitely work that needs to be picked up, is looking at the actual genetic differences between these populations, not just their plumage.
Right. The last two questions here are kind of along the same lines, and I'm going to call these the last questions because we're just over time.
Okay.
So Matt, what can humans do to improve habitat for bluebirds?
Great question. Well, the best way is to put up a nest box in your backyard. So they're not too picky in their nesting requirements unless they're an azure bluebird. And so if you have any type of edge habitat, especially if you're even out west, if you have an edge habitat with, a pine forest and then an open field, if you stick a nest box there or even a few, you're going to have some bluebirds probably utilize those nest boxes depending on the type of habitat. That's certainly the best way that you can help them out. They are insectivores, so in the wintertime, they will come to your feeders if you provide them mealworms, or they'll even eat off of suet, so you can supplementally feed them as well. But, luckily the eastern bluebird population is pretty stable. They're increasing thanks to nest box programs. The westerns are doing the worst, but they're getting back up there, and mountains are kind of in the same boat. But yeah, just putting up nest box trails or just even a few nest boxes is the best way to help them.
Right on. Well, thank you again, Matt. And again, I'm going to call it there because we are over time. If you missed any portion of today's presentation, it was recorded. So just keep your eye out on all things Audubon Southwest. You'll see it pop up on our website, our social media, our YouTube channel. And be sure to join us tomorrow at the same time. We'll be hearing from Heaven Sanchez of Arizona State University and her work with MODIS tracking and the Bottery sparrow. Right on. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon.